Well, bottom of the ninth, I'm the closer. Purpose of the closer is to make as few pitches as possible and be as productive as can be. So we'll see what we can do here with the next 25, 30 minutes. One of the tasks that Pat gave me was the task of trying to pull together these 2 days. It is one of the interesting ways of doing a talk when you recognize that you can prepare the concept a little bit, but you can't fill in the text until you've listened to other people's text. But my first response to what we've heard in these 2 days of the conference is OMG. I remember the conference 8 years ago. That was my first. I wasn't at the very first conference. And it was good. I mean, it was real good, but it was nothing like this. The energy here, the specificity of what we've been talking about is really something special. And I would say that my days in the Navy, I learned all sorts of jargon that I probably ought not share in this kind of forum. But one of the things that you learned real early on in the Navy was that sometimes you got so much information so fast that you simply broke down to the old idea that you were drinking from a fire hose. And the Navy teaches you to drink from a fire hose, but until I met you folks, I never knew what it was like to drink from a fire hose connected to a turbo pump. This has been the most extraordinary several days. Obviously, I come to this event with all sorts of different kinds of background in the space sector. Secure World Foundation, my current employer, we worry a lot about space sustainability. We deal with debris issues. We deal with planetary defense. We deal with almost anything connected to space that involves cooperative and collaborative decision making, either between segments of one society or between countries. And so we've done a lot with space situational awareness, debris mitigation. We actually have a resolution that will come through the General Assembly this month on planetary defense, on a decision mechanism that gets countries to share with each other the process of figuring out what we do if we ever did find an asteroid headed our way. You know, Bruce Willis isn't available. We don't want to necessarily nuke it, and we can't get the shuttle anymore. So, figuring out what we do is pretty important. I'm no longer president of ISU, but I certainly thank ISU for sponsoring this talk. I am still a proud member of the faculty of ISU and have had a chance to see those remarkable students a couple of times this year. For those of you who've done ISU, great. For those of you who haven't, add them to your team. They build networks, they know how to build networks, and they love this business. And increasingly, they are present in the commercial side of space. There's a kind of love of the entrepreneurial zeal that they feel in this kind of room. They've got that kind of energy, and that kind of energy is supported here. So I imagine many of you have heard Secure World Foundation, many of you have heard of ISU, fewer have heard of what LA basically said at the end of his talk, and that's the 10 to the 9th Plus Foundation. I am the chairman of that. That is the not-for-profit piece that was spun off when Singularity University became a benefit corporation. We focus on the value of what does it take to improve the lives of 1 billion people in 10 years using rapidly accelerating technologies. Part of what our exercise is to say there are a lot of people afraid of artificial intelligence, genomics, nanotech, and some of their implications. We try to find ways that they can be useful and try to fund projects that can advance that. And of course, several of you have made use of these technologies. I also, I guess, would have to say I am an absolute fan of the ISPCS. 8 years ago, my love affair with this organization began. The thought that we're going to have the 10th anniversary next year, I may hit a foundation that's 10 to the 9th plus, but the power of 10 next year, don't miss it. It is going to be something else. And the reason it's going to be something else is because the idea generation capacity of this symposium is one of those rapidly accelerating technologies. Dreams that I heard 8 years ago are being reported on as actualities in this meeting. And in fact, between now and next year, there are so many things on the agenda that I think we all need to have both a chance to reflect on that decade, but also one grand party. And you know that it's ISPCS, so there'll be a little of both. So my goal today is to take a title that I picked before I listened to everything you had to say and integrate it into some of the reactions I've had as you've been talking to each other. And the title I picked was Go for Staging. And you're going to see that I'm going to play some games with the word staging. But for those of you that lived the Apollo era the way I did, this was just part of the exciting language. It was a lot more exciting to me than we have cleared the tower, I've got to tell you. But there was a sense in staging that you were really making progress, that something important had happened. And so a number of years ago, actually just for fun, I went back and wondered whether the transcripts of what I remember hearing through the public affairs officer and the announcements of launches of the Apollo flights were available. And they are. Their Office of the Historian has published the whole transcript. And it's the whole transcript, not just what I remembered hearing. And I think that the Apollo 12 transcript is something every single one here ought to read. Read the first 11 minutes. Waiting for launch, that's not all that much fun. But read the first 11 minutes of that transcript, actual launch 11 minutes. That is, from the time it leaves the pad to the time, essentially, they get to orbit. Because it'll tell you something about the way I'm thinking about go for staging. During this transcript, and I'm not going to spoil the whole story for you, but during this transcript, almost every horror story you can imagine about being in space in a tiny little box, being launched up to 17,500 miles an hour, almost everything that could go wrong did go wrong. There's lightning, there are power failures, there are gauges that fail. What the ground is seeing is different from what the Astros are seeing. It was an interesting time. And yet, through that, 2 stagings took place. The public affairs officer is bravely saying, we have had a successful staging and we are now operating on the second stage, which is burning a nominal, everything is perfectly fine. But in the background, the Astros are saying, what the heck, over? What's going on here? Something weird's happening. But they got to orbit. They got to the moon. They got back. And the analogy there is interesting because, as we'll see as we move along, there are lessons to be learned that are important for all of us that are trying to make very difficult things happen when several difficult things are happening at the same time, and where not all of them are working according to plan. So first of all, the first discussion of staging that I want to get into is the one that we're probably all thinking about most of all, the image of one stage separating from another as the spent stage falls back to Earth and we move on. And I've sort of labeled this part of the discussion as staging in your own stack. That is, this is the part you sort of control. You control the engineering of your own business. You've built your business plan. You know what's going on inside your shop. All of us that have actually run an organization know that that's not always true. There's the old line attributed to Robespierre that he saw the mob go by in Paris and got up to follow them, and Danton pulls him back and says, "What the heck are you doing? It's only the mob." And he says, "Of course it's the mob. I'm their leader. I've got to know where they're going." So in your own stack is not uncomplicated, but at least it's your own stack. Okay, so you know that these stages are your stages. One of the first things you've got to do inside that stack, and I've heard this come up in several of the discussions in the last, several presentations, is that you need to power your business planning in a way that accounts for transition and change. That is, you have to be contemplating where your business is going to be after you've been successful at what you are currently attempting to be successful at. Because the transitions are going to be important to you. Some of the IP that might be getting developed right now that is sort of accidental or incidental to what you're immediately trying to do may in fact be the powerhouse that powers the second stage as you move to gain additional momentum in your business. You need to keep a focus on the fact that future planning, future dreaming, future engineering is not something that goes away once you're executing your original business plan. Actually, it's an exciting part of life. Nobody likes to simply feel like they're pushing papers across a desk. On the other hand, it's awful easy to say, "I got a problem today. I don't have time to think about tomorrow." You've got to think about tomorrow. And the evidence of these last 2 days is that the people who were dreaming 8 years ago have been thinking about tomorrow a lot. Because we're not only talking about what they got done with the dreams they shared with us 8 years ago, and I'm sure there were others 9 at the first session. They're talking about what they're doing next and how what they're doing now is going the next level. Keep up that energy. It's not always obvious that that's easy. The other thing to keep in mind working with your own stack, and this is different, I think, from 8 years ago, is that the strategy of acquiring and adding value is extraordinarily important. 8 years ago, there was a lot of independence thinking. I'm going to do this on my own. I'm going to prove I don't need any help. I certainly don't need the big players because they've blown it. I don't need the government because they can't do this, that, or the other thing. And I certainly don't need your advice because my intellect is sufficient unto itself. There was a lot of that. And there were a lot of people cautioning it wasn't a great idea. And what's really emerged is an understanding that we've managed to fuse that kind of independent, self-confident, driven goal-making of 8 years ago into a more coherent whole that's actually taken some advice, learned some hard lessons, worked back. I've heard a lot more discussion about sort of shared idea focusing, government talking to small business, talking to large business and small business talking together. This is a lesson of the last 8 years that we've managed to recognize how we maintain the balance between what works and what we're trying to throw away. I mean, obviously, one great case is seeing sort of how NASA's HL-20 has morphed into a space dev project that then got acquired by Sierra Nevada. The idea has had perpetuity. The methodology has shown synergy. So the perpetuity of an idea and the synergy of execution have become part of the way we make things happen. It really is a transformation. We are, as I used to love to say in my higher education career, we are a learning community. This is obviously useful. The last thing I'll say, just to try to distill some images that I've had as we've gone along, the last thing I'll say about this staging in your own stack is don't confine innovation to engineering. I mean, there's some extraordinary engineering going on and some extraordinary innovation in that engineering, but also there has been extraordinary innovation in business planning, some really interesting combinations of new technical ideas with good outreach to political decision makers who have to do something to decide how to implement some of those ideas. Some of the we-they thinking that we battled with 8 years ago has been transformed into some really creative work. I don't want to give out prizes for the greatest achievement in each area, but I was certainly impressed when now a month ago, I heard a European lawyer talk about X-Corps' development of the wet lease concept for Curaçao that will allow Lynx to fly out of a non-American facility when it could have been prohibited by ITAR from doing so. That was creative, that was innovative, that works. That's what we're about. And I think that's the place where we've held together the values of that first session that I attended in 2006, that we're about finding things that work, making them work, taking responsibility for them to work, and then looking for how that can be parlayed into the next thing that works. So, let's leave staging in your own stack a little bit and look at one of the other meanings of staging, which of course is to look at the various stages of growth. We talk about the stages of a young person's growth, to talk about the stages of the evolution of an idea, the life cycle theory of growth. The fact is, we aren't at the beginning of this industry anymore. But there are players who are beginning to join this industry who are at the beginning of their idea. And so we have this challenge of recognizing that we're not all in the same position with our business plans, with our growth plans. I mean, we have the challenge now of making sure that we don't fall into the trap we warned each other about, of assuming that our ideas were now, so much better than this new generation's ideas that we don't understand the new generation. I mean, we have to test ourselves against the risk that we end up with what my dissertation advisor once called hardening of the categories. And I think what I heard in the sessions here is that we're doing a pretty good job of that. I mean, we're not putting down anybody's idea. We're warning people about some of the risks that we think might be involved, but we aren't giving up on the idea that a brand new idea might, in fact, be rewarding. There's the grand old story most of you have heard of Newton having said that all the great accomplishments that came to him, if I have seen farther than other men, it's because I've stood on the shoulders of giants. Well, it's a wonderful quote. It's a magnificent quote. Keep in mind, however, if you think that the current generation is seeing less far than it ought to, it may be occasionally because we've allowed giants to stand on their shoulders. Don't assume, for example, that a great idea that is perhaps challenging our paradigms is any less valuable than were the great ideas we were sharing with each other when we were mostly paradigm chasers. Now we're achievers. But we're close enough to that time when we were the rebels to maybe remember that we ought not give up on the power of the rebel. I'd say that another thing about the stage of our growth is we've come to a point where we're much more open to partnerships, and I'm really quite encouraged by that, because I think getting to any place worth getting to in space is going to come more completely, more fully, I think quicker, as we find ways to make use of synergies, to make use of our capacity to do things together. Now, that doesn't mean that we, all get into one happy family and we do this as if we had no disagreements with each other. It does mean that we keep careful attention to the fact that we're probably not getting to really new, exciting business plans without keeping an eye on who our partner might be to cover that part of our dream that is not our expertise. That, I think, leads us to know that synergy is, in fact, good business. That has led to another interesting synergy. The anti-government rhetoric of 8 years ago has sort of gone away for two reasons. One, I think we've begun to realize that government can be a pretty good customer. Even a reliable customer, at least when it's not having a adolescent sandbox fight. On the other hand, I think it's in part because government has sort of crossed a transition where it recognizes that we've proven our credibility. We've proven we can deliver. We've proven in many cases that we're on the track to delivering on our promise to do things better and cheaper in certain parts of the space sector than would have been done if we had not entered into the marketplace. So obviously finding customers beyond government is a full-time part of our job, but our ability to make government an authentic customer, especially in low Earth orbit, and I'm thinking increasingly in a part of the industry we didn't talk as much about, which is component manufacture and subcontracting, is proving to be a good development. And the fact that we had several people from the public sector actually the private sector actually managing to represent people in the public sector because they couldn't get here is something I would not have expected to see 8 years ago. And it is something that I think we can feel good about. I think in the same vein, we're looking for the next big things, new markets, ways to get beyond what we're doing for the government, hopefully get ever better at doing resupply and crew transportation, but also to look for other things where there are other sources of income. I think flying science is a big possibility. We heard people say that a scientist with a great idea might wait 5 to 10 years to get it on orbit. I think there are people in this room that are going to be able to dramatically reduce the time it takes to get a good experiment into space. Obviously, we're creating those opportunities already in suborbital context, but I think we're also going to do that in orbital. And we're going to find that there's a market there. I won't call it a mass market, but it's different from a restricted government market. I mean, you're going to be talking about volumes that are different than we've been talking about recently. And with volume, of course, comes economy of scale. I think resource recovery is a possibility. I don't really remember people getting much into this idea of pulling back raw material from space, either to use in space, which is rather one of the more interesting uses of raw material that we might find on an asteroid or a comet or the moon or whatever, or to bring back to Earth to deal with some of these particularly metals that are getting to be in short supply. The reality is that's going to need transportation. That's going to need innovative artificial intelligence robotic machinery. That's going to require some extraordinarily good business planning. But you know something? 8 years ago, I heard people talking about business plans that some people were in fact snickering at that are beginning to get close to a credible opportunity to return a profit. And so understand that this too may be one of those. Keep your eye on DARPA's Phoenix project. I think this is a very interesting project. This is an on-orbit servicing test case where they're going to see whether a robotic spacecraft could actually go to space junk, particularly intact spacecraft that have simply run out of fuel or in some other way failed because maybe of a bus failure or something of that kind, and harvest parts to use on other satellites. If this works, not only will there be an interesting market in making devices that could do this, but there's going to be a transportation market. Something's got to get this thing to orbit. I think the plan is to try a test flight of that next year. And so very, very interesting. On-orbit servicing is getting closer to a demonstration level of technology, and I would suggest you keep an eye on that. Another project in desperate need of a good business mind to find a business plan for it is debris removal. Currently, the only way a business case closes on debris removal is if a government pays for it, which is sort of the equivalent of saying, and then a miracle happens. But that's not necessarily the only way we will close a business case there. Various breakthroughs in the cost of getting to orbit or the cost of staying on orbit with something that can prove its ability to remove debris may in fact be a critical issue here. I suspect we do still need a few breakthrough technologies to close a business plan. But there have been some innovative thinkers over the years that have simply found a way to do something differently with what technology already existed. And I'm not going to abandon hope that we find that with debris as well. It's going to be easier to remove the big pieces of debris than the little pieces of debris, I'm afraid, for a while. And even a 10-centimeter piece, which is the largest we admit being able to track, moving at 17,500 miles an hour, is sort of a cause for concern. Nonetheless, keep an eye on that and keep thinking about it, because we need some good minds to find a way to deal with this. An issue that has been of concern to Secure World Foundation is that there's a hidden problem with debris we don't often think about. And that is, the most developed countries will probably be able to survive in a greater debris environment than today for some considerable length of time. They can develop avoidance mechanisms. They have ground-based infrastructure to track the stuff. They have greater redundancy. CNES has, the French Space Agency, has published some interesting studies about how many satellites they think they might lose to debris over the next 10 years. And it's not zero. But what keeps them going is redundancy. If you're Uganda with a single satellite, or you're Ecuador, which just, of course, had a satellite blinded by a collision with debris this year, you don't have an immediate replacement. And so one of the hidden problems of debris is that it hits newcomers and the less wealthy much harder. And a lot of the less wealthy, of course, have used space to replace ground-based infrastructure. That is, to leap over ground-based infrastructure. So it's a nasty problem. Another business, and I was really pleased to hear that because nobody talked about it 8 years ago, is flight testing hardware. That is, taking a piece of equipment to space and proving that it can endure that environment is extraordinarily valuable to somebody who's trying to convince NASA or the European Space Agency or ISRO or the Japanese Space Agency or anybody of that kind that it is in fact possible to use their hardware on orbit reliably. There's a business there. You can add value, and of course the cost is essentially providing the power budget and dealing with the launch weight. It's certainly worth doing. Cisco, of course, is probably one of the most interesting business cases on that, where they threw a router into space. They basically piggybacked it on another launch in order to prove that not exactly an off-the-shelf router, but a router with relatively small modifications could in fact function in space. And they sort of blew some minds that, yeah, for the most part, it functioned pretty well. How well it would function in GEO, who knows? But by the time they put it up again and put it up much higher, they had protected it more against radiation, and it was still cheaper than a space-designed piece of hardware, and they had been able to prove that it could function. So flight-proving hardware is important. I think one of the other things that was interesting as we talked about the stage of our business that we are in was the several people that indicated that it was a somewhat more stable market now. And that's interesting because none of us would have predicted 8 years ago that we would have been in a more stable market now. But what makes it stable? I mean, we have governments that are in a little bit of disarray, budgets are tight, you can't quite be sure who's going to pay for what. What makes it more stable? I think we need to keep in mind, going back to the synergy comment and the partnership comment, that part of what is driving stability is diversification. If you've had an MBA, somebody beat you up with understanding market betas. And the way to deal with beta, which is in fact this sort of risk component originally taken out of financial risk calculations, is you diversify. If you've got a financial advisor and you own one stock, that financial advisor is beating you up. But what we're beginning to do is diversify our business. We're getting more different types of customers. If it's more stable, it's in part because we're managing not just to sell to one kind of customer or only one kind of product. We're getting to the point where we're beginning to recognize that large, healthy businesses have a broad customer base. And that is something you need to look yourself in the mirror, get your arms around your neck, and pat yourself on the back. There are a lot of industries that have trouble figuring that out. There's evidence that the improved stability that some people are perceiving is coming from diversification. So, third definition of staging. The other definition of staging, if you ever sold a house, your real estate agent will talk about staging the house, making sure it shows well, making sure it presents well. This is a place where we're still learning as we go on. Our communications capability in this business has not been our absolute strongest suit. We still sort of love to get right down to the engineering quick, and if somebody's eyes glaze over, well, we continue discussing the engineering. Increasingly, we need to find ways to get the core message out here that something really exciting is happening. That a larger cross-section of the human species is now involved in finding ways that don't always depend on the same pathway to get human beings to experience and benefit from space assets. So the first part of our story that I think we need to spend more time talking about to the public is a quote that came out of at least 3 different presentations in one form or another that could be translated into, "We have achieved." This is not just about what we're hoping to do. It's about what we have done, that we made promises and we kept promises. In this communications environment, in today's America, and I will tell you it's exactly the same in today's Europe, the notion that you made a promise and kept it is news. And you need to be willing to say, look, we said we would be able to do things in a different way, with a different structure, with leaner teams, and with reliability. Well, if you don't have 6 to 10 examples in your mind from these sessions, then you haven't attended the sessions I've attended. You have that kind of data that needs to be shared. Now, I love to get people doing things across continents, Europe and North America and Asia. It's sort of the game I've played most of my life. But, there's competition between continents, too. And I will tell you something that I heard this year. I heard it in September, on September 5th, in Brussels at the European Satellite Day Conference. And it is the first time I've heard that in Europe in 8 years. That is, the United States is becoming a competitor again in the satellite industry and in the launch industry. And you know, the launch industry is largely because people are looking at reduced prices from the big guys and a lot of price competition showing up in what SpaceX and Orbital are being able to suggest is really now available. This is exciting. The satellite business, the government played a little role in, I think. The launch business, you know, it's people who've attended this conference that have been doing that in launch. And I'll tell you, 8 years ago, there were a lot of people giggling when folks said, I'm going to get the price of launch down, and people just shook their heads and said, do they know how hard this is? Well, yes. Now, 8 years later, most of you really know how hard this is. But so too do the big players know that you're capable of solving hard problems. And they're beginning to learn from some of what you've done, and so who knows? They may be more significant competition with you going forward than they've been recently. The second thing, of course, in the story now, we're not just talking about advocating synergy. In the story, we need to be talking about collaboration more. You know, America's sort of tired of people having sandbox fights. I mean, we talk a lot about the political side of this, but there's more to that. You know, there's a lot of news coverage of people, you know, ripping at each other with claws. We have, in fact, done a certain amount of, you know, down and dirty competition with each other, but we've also shown a model of collaboration that doesn't eliminate competitive energy. And we simply need to make that part of our communication strategy because people want to know that some of that old Horatio Alger stuff is still possible. You know, that people really can work with each other for a common cause even while advancing themselves. You don't have to make it up. You just have to tell the story. But you have to tell the story. It shouldn't be kept secret. I think we also need to talk about the greater good story. There's a lot of talk about what happens if we lose a fee-paid passenger space traveler. And, you know, none of us want to see that day. Almost all of us, I guess, you know, sort of recognize that, you know, if you can have accidents in non-experimental technologies, you're certainly going to have them in experimental technology. One of the things we have to do is get a message out there that the people flying to space, for the most part, are not joyriders. They are not rich people out for a ride in their Bugatti. You know, they got rich in many cases because many of the customers are not folks who just sort of got lucky and won the lottery. They've earned a lot of money doing some very complicated things. These people are smart. And some of them see this as part of their contribution to significance. Part of the way to translate success into significance. They talk about what they want to do with their experience and how they want to talk about it. I'd suggest that we get more of these people on tape before they fly, really talking about some of their gut motivations. I've heard these people talk. They've got some really exciting reasons. And they're different from me mainly in that they've got some more money than I have. But they often have some really, really interesting reasons for going to space. And I've heard lots of people, I mean, I've heard Dennis Tito talk about his experiences in ways that motivate people. Anusha Ansari is the best in the business at it. She just does a wonderful job with it. The best blog about what it's like to live more than a week on the space station ever done was Anusha's. It's still online. You ought to read it. The insights are off the charts. But there are a lot of people who want to do more than just fly. It's not like they're just going to, you know, be able to talk in a cocktail party. And we need to get that story out because if a disaster happens, being able to say that somebody lost their life doing something significant is more important for us than simply saying somebody lost their life for taking a joyride. Because then somebody said, well, why bother? I mean, why should you risk this kind of behavior? You know, if you can say we risk it because these people had some really important goals and other people have now got to fulfill those goals. That's one reason why we recovered from both Challenger and Columbia, is we were able to make that case in the public context. We need to make that case in the private context. And then the last thing, and this I guess you would expect from me, 35, 36 years of career in academe, is part of the message is just be shameless in trying to inspire the next generation. Find a way to let them see what you're doing. If there's any way they can touch any piece of what you're doing, do it. If you can spare some employees, even if it puts your schedule off by a day, to do something that shows some young people that this really is a future worth their investing a life in. Investing money is one thing. You only got one life. You get lots of bucks, but you only get one life. And it's tough to completely diversify a life. So when you make a commitment, you tend to make a commitment. You need to be willing to share that kind of inspiration with young folks. And, a number of years ago, talking to some ISU students, I closed with a comment that I think is appropriate here, and that is, there comes a point at the far horizon where everybody's vision, no matter how good they are, no matter how much of a celebrity they are, everybody's vision becomes cloudy. I mean, you can only see so far. At that point, what matters most is that we've taught the next generation to see. So you got some work ahead of you, but I'll see you next year.